In a world where people don't care much about history, Albert Luthuli is today mostly remembered as the person after whom the ANC's headquarters is named. Now, in South Africa, it is often said that the country is not governed from the Union buildings but from Luthuli House, which is another way of saying that the ruling party doesn't understand the difference between party and state, and that the country is effectively governed by the ruling party as a political party with particular interests, as opposed to the government that is supposed to have the interests of all the people living in this country at its heart. So in this video, I want to share with you several remarkable things about Albert Luthuli that you probably didn't know, and that certainly is worth taking note of. But firstly, a few biographical notes. Luthuli was born in the city of Bulawayo, in which is today Zimbabwe. He wasn't quite sure in which year he was born, but he guessed it to be 1898. When he was young, his family moved to Groutville in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, which is the town that he regarded as his hometown. Luthuli was an outspoken Christian. He was also an outspoken Zulu. He became the president of the African National Congress, or the ANC, which eventually became the ruling party in South Africa in 1994. But his presidency was from the year 1952 up until his death in 1967. He was also a winner of the Nobel Prize, and he famously led the ANC's defiance campaign against past laws during his time in the ANC. So let's get started with a list of remarkable facts of Albert Luthuli that is worth taking note of. The first is that Luthuli was not just a Christian, but that he was very spoken against what he described as Paternalist Christianity, which was a form of Christianity that he attributed largely to white people and to missionaries coming to continents like Africa and countries like South Africa in particular. And his concern with this paternalist form of Christianity was that many white missionaries had the tendency of trying to convert black people in Africa and South Africa towards Christianity, but not just that, also to convert them culturally. In other words, to try to convince them to accept Christ as their savior, but then on top of that, to try to convince them to become more like white people, culturally speaking. This white example of Christianity, as Luthuli described it, became a stumbling block for a lot of black people living in South Africa and on the African continent, because they were eager to accept Christ as their savior, but the consequence of the way in which this Christianity was presented to them led to them doubting their own culture and civilization, which led to, in many ways, an identity crisis among a lot of black people. So by implication, what Luthuli said and meant was that Christianity is a good thing and that people ought to accept Christ as their savior, but that we must be very cautious of trying to present Christianity as a way of rejecting others' cultures or trying to convince them to become culturally like you, the person trying to convey the message of Christianity. The second point about Albert Luthuli that is very remarkable is his description of a new pattern of democracy that ought to be implemented in South Africa. Remember that he led the ANC during the 1950s and 60s, and it was during this time that he said that South Africa ought to be structured politically in a way that would value people for who they are, what they believe, and how they contribute, as opposed to what their race is. The fourth point is about Luthuli's view on culture. Now, Albert Luthuli was a proud Zulu, and he went as far as establishing the Zulu language and cultural society, through which he aimed to encourage and promote Zulu culture. But it seems that towards the end of his life, his view on culture has changed somewhat to a view that is very comparable to what many other leaders in the ANC started to believe. This was a view in which tribal identity among black people was regarded as backwards. And so even though Luthuli was initially very outspoken in favor of Zulu culture and the variety of African cultures in South Africa, towards the end of his life he argued for the fight against cultural backwardness and tribal backwardness among black people in South Africa, which presumably means that his argument was more for one along the lines of that we should shake off our old cultural identities and accept this new identity, which is South Africanism, to fill the void. The fourth point that is quite remarkable is his explanation as to why the ANC, the African National Congress, was founded and what it fought against. Now, Albert Luthuli explicitly states that the ANC was founded in response to the unionization of South Africa. Now, unionization happened after the Anglo-Boer War, which led to the eventual signing of the peace treaty at Vereniging, according to which the different Boer republics and the different British colonies in South Africa would be united into becoming one big country under the British Crown. And it was in response to this unionization of South Africa that Luthuli says the ANC was founded. And it was this unionization of South Africa that, according to Luthuli, the ANC aimed to fight against. The fifth point has to do with Luthuli's view on leadership. A strong leader, according to Luthuli, is someone who is not afraid to take a stand against what the government is doing. And so Luthuli remarked at the time that the National Party government had this strange affinity for engaging with weak leaders. And what he meant by that was that the National Party claimed in many cases to consult with the public about certain policy ideas that they wanted to implement, but in these consultations they made sure to consult with weak leaders as opposed to strong leaders. In other words, to consult with leaders within the black community or black communities who would naturally agree with what the government wanted to do, as opposed to those who had the strength to take a stance against what the government wanted to do. The government then used this as an excuse to say that they did consult with the people and that the people agree with them. And so his call was for strong leadership, which implied taking a stance against what the government was doing, and also for the government not merely to consult with weak leaders who would agree with whatever the government wants to do, but to actually consult with the strong leaders in society who are not afraid to take a stance against the government's plans and projects. And so the sixth point has to do with Luthuli's view on economics, at least on a micro scale, you could say. Albert Luthuli, even though he was an abstentionist and he didn't drink any alcohol, was very much against the banning of home brewing. And he explained that even though he was very aware of the evils of alcohol and the potential destructiveness thereof, we ought to recognize that for many mothers, home brewing was the only way in which they could care for their families. So Luthuli appeared to have been instinctively against the idea of government trying to over-regulate the economy. And so the sixth point is on race laws. At the time when Luthuli was alive, there was roughly speaking about 70 race laws in South Africa according to the Race Law Index. But Luthuli said that there are so many race laws that when you try to read them, it feels as if there is no end to them. He added that these race laws, in other words laws that categorized people according to the color of their skin and demanded that they be treated differently as a result thereof, is injurious to people and denigrating to their human dignity. And so he was very much against the idea of implementing race laws. And so the eighth and final remarkable fact about Albert Luthuli that I want to share with you has to do with his views on communism. Luthuli was very much against communism, which he described as a false theory based on a false religion. Yet, he was not too concerned about having communists within the ANC or the ANC being partnered or allied with the South African Communist Party, because he argued that they had an important goal in common. And so Luthuli's view was that the fact that he's working with the communists should not be interpreted as that he endorses their ideology. He then said that as a result of the fact that they are fighting against a common foe or working towards a common goal, he sees that they could actually work together, but once the country has been liberated, once they have succeeded in this goal, then they would have to sort this problem with communism out. Now, think about these facts that I just shared with you, and then think about the extent to which the ANC as we know them today has deviated from the vision and the ideas of one of their great founding fathers, Albert Luthuli.